I'd like to ask Eric Smith, who is our Senior Vice President at the CWTA, to talk to us about the impact of COVID on our industry and some of the trends that we've been seeing over the last 6 to 9 months. Eric, the floor is yours, my friend.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks very much. So as Rob mentioned, each year we do commission an economic impact study of the industry in Canada. And traditionally, as Rob mentioned, we look at the wireless industry. But as we saw the events of 2020 unfold, we realized we needed to take a wider view. But before we get to the results of this Accenture study, we want to provide a bit of a context and look at the impact that COVID-19 has had both on our industry and on Canadians. Much has been written about COVID-19. There's been a lot of people looking at various industries, segments of society, etc. A lot of it global in nature, and we wanted to provide a bit of a Canadian context. Now, the title of my presentation, Managing Networks in Unprecedented Times, that's taken from a series of reports we did earlier this summer, which are available on our website. And I realized that anytime you use the word unprecedented, that usually just means you haven't looked back far enough. And I this ad from during the 1918 pandemic shows how far back telecommunications goes and how it was important even back in 1918. And this is an ad, as you see, from New York Telephone. I thought it was just interesting. Now, I think what the first thing that jumps out at us is really the quick action of Canada's network operators when COVID, really the lockdowns started. There was an overnight transformation in the way people, their habits and how they were using telecommunication services. Operators were faced with incredible challenges at the outset of the pandemic. Like their customers, operators' employees were impacted by public health measures, stay-at-home orders, etc. And many of the operator functions had to be transitioned to a widely dispersed work-from-home network of employees. And with the changes and the increases in traffic and changes in usage patterns, network monitoring took on a new level of importance. It was always 24/7, but this was really 24/7. And operators had to quickly add network capacity where needed. Operators also worked closely with governments, hospitals, and other essential services to ensure that they received the critical support that they needed. Customers as well needed a lot of support. Operators took steps to make the transition to work from home easier. Measures included waiving of certain wireless service fees and lifting of data caps on home and small business internet plans. Service providers also offered flexible payment options to those experiencing financial difficulties. As we've moved into what some people are calling the second phase of COVID, with new restrictive measures in some regions, some of these programs are being extended, and particularly those that are targeting the most vulnerable communities. And in addition to customer support for community organizations, our facilities-based service providers launched initiatives in support of organizations that are helping Canadians during the difficult time of COVID-19. Just some of the organizations receiving assistance include Canadian Red Cross, Canadian Mental Health Association, Kids Help Phone, Big Brothers Sisters of Canada, Women's Shelters Canada, Food Banks Canada, and Community Food Services Canada. When we look at network traffic, I mentioned we want to look at Canada, which we will in a moment, but globally, this is just one particular study from Nokia, and showing that between March and April globally, we saw between 30 and 50% traffic growth on networks. In September, it's come down a little bit, 20 to 30%, but still above pre-pandemic levels. And just some of the use cases, so obviously 30% increase in video subscribers, 23% in VPN endpoints, almost 50% in denial of service traffic. And I think the takeaway quote here from the report is, a year's traffic growth in just a few weeks. So when we get to Canada, now I know that this graphic is hard to read because it's pretty small, but I'm just going to walk you through it a bit. So as lockdown measures came in place and we knew that we were seeing changes in network behavior around the world, we wanted to take a little closer look at Canada because a lot of the information out there was global or larger markets like the US or the EU. And so we embarked on a task working with carriers to gather information to look at how traffic patterns had changed. And importantly, we weren't interested in just peak traffic. Rather, we wanted to see a general representation of daily traffic by measuring traffic on the same day of the week every 2 weeks. And it's an important distinction is that you'll see some stats out there talking about peak traffic, but really what we've seen is where traditionally peak traffic was, a couple hours, 3 or 4 hours a day. What we've seen is traffic levels have been really at peak throughout much of the day, much longer period of time. And so when we designed this, we just arbitrarily, really, we chose the day of Monday. It's historically not the busiest day of the week. And again, we didn't want to be seen to be trying to inflate numbers. We just wanted to have a representative day. And we took data from several Mondays before the lockdown to create a baseline. And then we compared daily traffic after the lockdowns were put in place. So as I said, the numbers may be a little bit hard to read, but just to explain it to you. Well, first of all, I'll tell you that all this information can be found on our website. So if you're interested in taking a closer look, you can go to cwta.ca. And if you click on the news tab, you'll see references to 3 separate reports that have the title Managing Networks in Unprecedented Times, and you'll see these charts there. The data that you see runs from March 16th to July 20th. We did take some readings after that, which is sort of confirmed what you're already seeing here. We haven't published that data. The vertical lines you see, they represent and then there's vertical lines and percentages at the top and the bottom. And they represent the range of increase among the carriers that were surveyed. So you'll see that in this case, we're looking at home internet traffic, and we look at both download and upload traffic. And you'll see that in the early days, we had a range of approximately 35% increase at the top end, and at the low end, 17% in terms of download usage. And then what we saw as the weeks went on, the low end stayed roughly the same, but the increase in download usage went up to about close to 50% in mid-April. Since that time, it's moderated a bit, but you'll see in all cases, all the carriers surveyed were still into the summer experiencing the traffic increases that were above pre-pandemic levels. What's also interesting is on the upload, you'll see huge increases in upload. While we don't definitively know the reason, I mean, a good educated guess is increasing use of interactive type applications, whether it's video conferencing, online gaming, what have you, but we're seeing a real dramatic increase in upload traffic for home internet. Now, when we get into mobile wireless, we were particularly interested because we are the Wireless Association to see this. And even before we saw the data, we assumed what we would see is a drop in wireless data usage for the very reason that with people sheltering in place, they were most likely relying on home internet or Wi-Fi rather than mobile wireless networks. And that's true to some extent, but what you'll see is there's a wide range in results here. So across the carriers surveyed, we saw a very wide difference in terms of traffic. You see that predictably, I think, in the early days when most people staying home, the traffic decreased for many carriers. But you also saw some that had increase in traffic. And really the reason for that is, again, the wireless industry is not monolithic across Canada. And so you'll have some carriers who have a greater proportion of their subscribers being people who are depending more on wireless connectivity than wireline connectivity. And what we saw as well as that while we had the dip at the beginning, the range continued to move upward, both for download and upload traffic throughout the summer. To get maybe a better picture of this, because the range was so broad, we wanted to look at the median as well. And you can see here the distinct pattern of an initial sort of trough and then a steady increase to where we got to the point in both download and upload of exceeding pre-pandemic levels, even as people were moving out of their home, becoming more mobile again. And those numbers reflected as far into the end of August, where we stopped taking the measurements. Now, while mobile wireless data fluctuated, voice was a huge surge. And I mentioned earlier on how in the very early days, there was, some carriers had to scramble quite quickly to add capacity to congestion points in the network. And a lot of that related to voice traffic. And you'll see here, in the early days, like 57, 60%, then down a bit to 44%, 46, etc. The one dip you see is a Monday in April. That's the third measurement where you'll see a negative. And that was Easter Monday, where most people were not working. We also assumed that a lot of the increase in voice traffic is the fact that even if people were home, they either didn't have landlines or they weren't using them for their activities like working. They may be either using a work-issued mobile device, or there may be more than one person in the house working. And so maybe one person's using the landline, but the other is using a mobile device. So that's sort of the traffic patterns we saw in Canada. In terms of, what were people doing with respect to creating this increase in traffic? Again, we want to look at some Canadian numbers from a variety of sources. So StatCan reported sort of early summer period that while total retail sales in Canada fell by 18% from February to May, e-commerce sales jumped 99.3% in Canada. There was also a study by Alternity, which reported that Canadians experienced 170% increase in remote work, not surprising. But what's also interesting is, I think the number of Canadians who are using online services more or for the first time since COVID started. And we can see here some of these things like online streaming, video conferencing, telemedicine, buying online, using restaurant apps, etc. And that shows a real shift in behaviors. In terms of how that impacted the enterprises or businesses, now these aren't Canadian numbers, these are North American numbers that come from McKinsey, is really the acceleration of the digitization of business and our society. We see in terms of the average share of customer interactions that were digital, we saw them jump from December 2019, 41% to 65%, which they measure as being an acceleration of, a 3-year acceleration. And in terms of the average, on the right, the average share of products and or services that are partially or fully digitized, we see a 6-year acceleration and a jump from 41% to 60%. So this incredible acceleration obviously could not have happened if our networks had not performed the way that they did. Another I thought useful from that same study, really interesting insight, is organizational changes and industry-wide changes. And again, this is a survey of corporate leaders in terms of what they expected the timelines would be for some of these activities and what actually happened. You saw, for example, an increase in remote working collaboration. The expectation was 454 days. The actual was 10.5. So, a multiple of 43%. And you can just go down and look at some of these stats, and it's just incredible how quickly society in North America was able to adjust to the imperative that COVID imposed upon us. And again, this could not have been possible without the high performance and resiliency of our telecom networks. And finally, changing mindset. I thought this was also very interesting. If you see the black bar at the bottom from a 2017 survey, almost 50% of corporate leaders viewed at technology adoption as a way to cut costs. And now, since the COVID crisis, you see that's 10% as they view it as primarily a source of savings. But the other things they're thinking of is they need to modernize in order to keep up with competitors. They need to invest more for competitive advantage. And that 20% are refocusing their entire business around digital technology. So this is a very incredible and fast change in mindset. We know how slowly mindsets can change, especially in large organizations. And there's debate, obviously, about how some of consumer behaviors may revert back to pre-COVID days, and obviously there will be more face-to-face interactions. But I think it's very reasonable to expect that a lot of consumer activities, especially those people who are trying out things for the new times, that may stick with them, and that their increased use of digital technologies will increase. And obviously, as companies are investing more in digital technologies, their adoption, I think, will continue past the COVID crisis. So, what we've seen, through this presentation is that our networks have been meeting demand, and as Rob mentioned in his opening, really exceeding expectations. As he mentioned, Accenture studies show that 90% of Canadian consumers felt their service provider met or exceeded COVID response expectations. And the well-known Gustafson Brand Trust Index out of, I believe it's the University of Victoria, showed that while overall brands in Canada are on the decline in terms of their trust level, interestingly, Canadian telecom companies' brand trust level has been on the rise since COVID came along. So obviously, the other thing that COVID has shown is that both wireline and wireless broadband has become critical infrastructure. And while the vast majority of Canadians have access to high quality telecommunications, there remain Canadian communities that are either underserved or not served at all. And it's imperative that they are able to participate in the digital economy. That's something that not only the government wants, but our industry wants as well. And we welcome recent announcements from the government around new funding programs like the Universal Broadband Fund and the earmarking of additional dollars for the Canada Infrastructure Bank going to broadband. But it's important to keep in mind that the government funding is a complement to private investment. It's not a replacement. And that's why, as Rob mentioned in his opening remarks, it's very important to us as an industry association, and I think it's important to all Canadians, that we have a regulatory framework that continues to encourage private investment. On the wireless side, we've had about $50 billion in investment, over $50 billion in CapEx investment, over $20 billion in spectrum. On the wireline side, since I think it's about 1996, I want to say it's about $150 billion in CapEx. And that is significant level of funding needs to continue into the future if we're going to connect Canadians and if we're going to adopt the next level of technology such as 5G.